From National Review headquarters in New York City, this is a Capital Writing author interview. Our guest today is David Bahnsen. David is the founder, managing partner, and chief investment officer with the Bahnsen Group. He is also a trustee of National Review Institute, and we are very grateful to have him on today to talk about his book, FullTime, Work and the Meaning of Life. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me, Dominic.
So you called the book FullTime. That might seem like a kind of anodyne title in a book about work, since most people who work do work full time. What do you mean by full time in the title, and why did you choose to call it that?
Yeah, so in a sense, I kind of thought it was very clever, and I have to give the credit to my wife here, as she very much assisted me in this creative name. But there's three things, and the third one is really the issue for me, and so I'll leave that for last because I think it's the one that'll be least interesting to listeners. First and foremost is the fact that I want to see a full-time engaged labor force. And so you're right, most people that have jobs and careers have to work full-time. But right now we have a lot of people that don't have jobs and careers. In other words, the declining labor participation rate from a, let's call it almost 69% level pre-financial crisis to about 62% now, that does not, to me, reflect a sort of full-time sense in the workforce. And so I am getting at that in an almost statistical or empirical way. But the second is the mentality. And that's where I think there's this opportunity for people to believe that there is a passion in work, or ought to be a purpose in work that leads to viewing it full time, and help kind of escape from this work-life balance concept where we look at it as, okay, how do I do enough work so I can get to yoga class, I can get to social time, happy hour, all of these different things, all of which may to some degree have their place, but they are not the things that we do work for. That work is this full-time component of an adult life by design. But if you look at chapter 8 of the book, this is the third and final part of my long answer. There was a book that has sold nearly 1 million copies, primarily in evangelical circles, called Halftime. And the subtitle tells it all. It said, Moving from Success to Significance. It was written by a gentleman named Bob Buford. He passed away a few years ago. I cannot even tell you how many churches across the country have used it as sort of a almost like a creed for their young adults or middle-aged adults or whatnot, in describing how people are to feel about this kind of midlife approach to career. That what we are to do is view the success we have as something that we, at the half point of our life, parlay into significance later by being more involved with our church, by being a more generous philanthropist, by extra time with our grandkids. All, again, things I think are wonderful, but all things that are very strongly, even if implicitly, putting a low priority on the work itself, pitting success against significance, pitting career against purpose. And I think that mentality is inherently dualist, and I think it is dangerous.
You mentioned the labor force participation rate. A sort of way to strawman this book might be to say that this is just someone complaining about how the kids don't want to work anymore. But you go through the labor force participation rate and you break it down into 3 different age groups, and you look at the problem as it affects young people, yes, but also as it affects older people. Can you explain the way that you split that up into 3 different parts?
Yeah, in the labor force, in the chapter you're referring to in the book, I walk through, as kind of the BLS data does, a sort of 55 plus set of statistics, a 29 to 54, and then a sub 29. And that's, I think, really useful to break out different statistical issues that I think are all problematic. Declining labor participation at the sub 29 reflects 2 different problems. One is the 16 to, let's call it, 23, where I just think there's been a war in our country on teenage employment. So the part-time jobs that a lot of us had at one point, hourly wages, just a kind of fresh entry into the workplace, oftentimes sweeping floors, working at a drive-through at a fast food place, working behind an ice cream counter. I think those things are really, really valuable for people before they go into their adult phase of life, or before they start a real career. They start to learn how to work well with others. They start to take orders from a boss they may not get along with. They learn how to show up on time, to clock in, clock out. There's just a character formation that I think is incredibly valuable. So that demographic, I think, is extremely problematic, that culturally and economically we've moved so far away from teenage employment and even college age and so forth. But then I think that within that 16 to 29 bracket, you do have to look at those in their late 20s that have left, that are not in the workforce, possibly not even having left it, just never joined it. This is where there's a lot of societal cliches, but they are very evident in the data. People living at home until their 30s, playing video games on mom's couch, that kind of stuff that we talk about. I think that's probably one of the most concerning trends we see in society, and just in terms of the maturity and productivity of so many young adults. And this is almost entirely males, not females. So then the other age bracket, though, is the one where I think people have to realize it is the biggest change in American society. That's prime working age men. Now you're talking 29 to 54, and we have a labor participation force that represents roughly 85% of that age bracket when you're talking about men. And these are prime working age people. And I understand there are some, it's a very, very statistically insignificant number, but there are some who are financially independent and not needing to work. I'm very critical of that too, why a 40-year-old who's financially independent would be completely out of productive labor. But regardless, that's not what we're talking about here. There is a significant amount that have left the workforce. And this is the work. Nick Eberstadt has done far more valuable work here than I could, highlighting what has become, I think, a cultural epidemic. And then the 55 and over is often, when you get up into the higher 50s, you start talking about the younger side of the baby boomers. And then, of course, the older baby boomers into their 70s. That's an entirely different set of issues. In fairness, post-COVID, that labor participation rate of the 55 plus had really dropped. It has come back. It's about at its pre-COVID level now, but it's nowhere near its pre-financial crisis level. And I understand a lot of 56, 57-year-olds did hit a financial point of independence. Yet I think it is societally very detrimental to lose the experience and expertise of that demographic. And I think that's what we're experiencing now is a total lack of the wisdom of so many of the, let's call it 65-year-olds that are now baby boomers that have retired, where they have been totally removed from the workforce. I think it has a huge impact on them. A lot of the worth and dignity and productivity that their contributions provided, they have been taken away. And then I think that at a more micro level, business, I'm almost 50-year-old business owner. I don't have the access to 65 and 68-year-olds that I would love to have for their experience and expertise. So there's a impact in that sense. And then across the whole society, I really believe the biggest message we've left 25, 30, 35-year-olds, there's no question the Gen Y, millennial generation, was deeply impacted by the baby boomers' messaging about retirement being the point of work. The boomers worked very hard. They built significant prosperity. They produced more goods and services than any generation in human history. But there was a cultural shift that talked about this concept of retirement. It didn't keep the boomers out of the workforce, but I think it has caused the millennials to be the first generation to actually resent the idea of work.
And so you see a problem with older people, with middle-aged people, with younger people. This is something that affects everyone in slightly different ways. You mentioned the concept of retirement as being freedom from work, or as being the purpose of work is to stop working. You mentioned that as one damaging idea that has sort of permeated in our culture. Another one that you mentioned that you brought up earlier is work-life balance. And this was something we ran a piece about this on the website, excerpted from the book. Um, uh, I had never thought of this before, but it's so obvious when you laid it out that work is a subset of life. Work is part of your life. So, how can you balance a part of something against the whole thing? It doesn't make any sense. Can you elaborate a little bit more on that?
Yeah, and a lot of people say, well, it's semantics, or you're kind of nitpicking on the verbiage, and I really do not think I am. I think the inescapable conclusion of the language is that there's your life, which is filled with the things you enjoy, the things that matter. Ergo, you're calling it your life, your purpose, your kind of essence, if you will, and you're seeking to balance against that your work. And I am with you, what you just said. It's a subset of life and therefore should not be pitted against it. But the point I want to make is that there's a whole lot of subsets in our life that we cannot spend 24 hours a day with our children. We cannot spend 24 hours a day with our spouses, as much as I'm sure many people would love to. But you can not spend 24 hours a day at work. And this is the only one I'm familiar with where people say, I have a work-life balance. They don't refer to a marriage-life balance. And that's probably a very good thing for their dinner time conversations with their spouse, that they don't do that. We basically understand that the complexity of an adult life has a certain compartmentalization dynamic to it. Sometimes it's seasonal, sometimes it's day by day. But the point being, people just figure out organically through the normal adult realities of life how to fit in all the things that are a part of their life. Only work is talked about as if something that is an enemy of one's life, and that is something you are doing for the purpose of escaping to get into this other realm where all the other components of life might be: the family, your exercise, your health, maybe church life, social life, and so forth. What I, as a proponent of work through this book, am not doing is asking people to make those other things a lower priority. I don't feel the need to belittle marriage, family, church for the purpose of advocating a strong and robust view of work. But it sure seems to me that others feel the need to belittle work for their own advocacy. This clearly comes not from trying to promote other life priorities, but trying to denigrate work.
And so the message in your book is that work is good and work is the meaning of life. These are not in contrast with each other. They are necessarily part of each other. Um, it's grounded in a very Christian worldview. You spend a significant amount of this time. You spend a significant chunk of the book interpreting the Bible, running through the Genesis account in creation, about when work was created, what God has said about work. Um, can you start in Genesis and sort of lay out what it is that you think is important from the creation story that should inform how we work today?
Yeah, not only can I do that, I have to do that. This is sort of my view that I think might be somewhat unique for those who have a reasonable familiarity with certain parts of Christian theology. That when I use language like work is the meaning of life, I'm not doing it for shock and awe. I'm well aware that some people may hear it and go, "Whoa, is he saying work is more important than our spouse? Is he saying work is more important than our relationship with Christ?" And I most certainly am not saying that, but the only reason one might interpret that is that they've been trained to believe about these things dualistically. My point is that this is what I believe a life in Christ is. This is what I believe is part of an adult life that involves a marriage, companionship, partnership. What are the husband and wife partnered together to do? To make dinner? I mean, I think that all of these things are a big, important part of life, but that partnership that we refer to is engaged in support for one another around the purpose, the telos of productive activity. And those things are not merely paycheck generating. It is not family and church fundraising. It is what God made us for. And so, to answer your question, I have to root it in Genesis 1, because this is where I have the entire worldview formed for me as to why God created humankind. What does it mean for a lifetime Christian like me to go around saying that I'm an image bearer of God and a dog is not, and a plant is not? That's an arrogant thing for human beings to say, but it's taught to us in Scripture that God viewed all of these components of his beautiful and amazing and intricate creation, this intricate design. All of it was good, and that humankind was very good. And he then tells us why in verses 26 through 28 of Genesis chapter 1. It was because he made us for the purpose of cultivating the garden, of stewarding the earth, of having dominion over the rest of the creation. Genesis chapter 2, verse 15, it goes on to talk about how the garden was this beautiful place, but now needed to be cared for. It wasn't completed. There was more planting to do, more stewardship, more cultivation. And this was the purpose of God creating mankind. And he, as image bearers of him, we share these attributes with him, his productive capacity, his creativity, his work. That's where I form the basis of these somewhat bold pronouncements of the book.
One other thing that you pulled out from the scriptural interpretation is the idea that the Hebrew word that is used often in the Bible for work is the same word that is used for worship. And this is something that you say provides more evidence for this idea that work is what God wants us to do. In addition to saying that humans are very good in creation, and then giving us the cultural mandate to cultivate the earth and so on. Work and worship are considered to be are often used as the exact same word.
Yeah, in fact, over 400 times in the Hebrew Scriptures. And so that word in question is avodah. The Hebrew prefix avo is the one that is used so many times and can be used in different grammatical contexts. But it's the exact word used in Exodus when it said, 6 days shalt thou work. And it's the exact word used in Genesis about God making us to work in the garden. And so then all the different context around worship, we see the way in which the very vocabulary connects work and worship, that these things are part of one and the same, that's how valuable it is to God, and how valuable the culture building and civilization building we do in our work is to God.
I think one of the things that might get Christians hung up on this as well, in addition to the idea, the false duality idea that you mentioned before, is all Christians are taught and should be taught that Christianity is not a works-based religion, that God does not need our work, that He does not. He is sufficient in all of His power over creation. He does not need us to do anything for Him. He does not lack for anything, right? And so I think some people might hear this idea of work and think, oh, is he saying I need to do work to get saved, or do I need to do work in order for God to be happy with me, and otherwise He's going to be mad at me if I don't work hard enough? What would your response be to somebody who is concerned about that aspect of it?
First of all, I do think he'll be mad at you if you don't work hard enough, but that is entirely separate in Protestant theology from whether or not one may still be saved. I still do believe in a significant amount of grace in the Christian religion, and yet the notion of cheap grace that basically says you do not have to do the things you're created to do, you don't have to pursue a life of obedience or productivity, and that because of that grace, we can dismiss the things that we're talking about here as God's expectations for us in our lives. I think is an abhorrent view, and specifically repudiated in Pauline epistles and certainly the book of James. But the point I'd make when it comes to work is nobody would say it as to why they want to go commit adultery or abandon their children. Why do I need to be a good husband or father? These things are covered, And because of grace and so forth, I'm going to fail in these other regards. No, it's a pretty basic part of Christian theology, this doctrine of sanctification. We're supposed to be working towards becoming more obedient, and we will make mistakes because on this side of glory, sin has still entered the world. And yet, I believe in the Christian doctrine of redemption. And so I make this point in the book that I believe work was made before the fall, before sin. I believe family was made before the fall, before sin. And then I believe that sin entered the world and resulted in certain curses and challenges and difficulties, but that the entire point of the Christian religion is that before Jesus came, it pointed to the cross. And since Jesus came, and of course his resurrection, we look backward to that moment as the defining point in history at which these things were paid for. And now we live in history, and I define history as this process of redemption. What I'm desperately asking Christians to do is understand that that includes their work. That just as much as there may be sin and there may be mistakes, these things are part of God's redemptive process. He is building his kingdom. This is what Jesus asked us to pray for. Thy will be done, thy kingdom come on earth as it is in heaven. This is the Lord's Prayer 101. And what does that mean? What is that kingdom building? What is that will? It is us being productive laborers in God's kingdom, building institutions, serving our neighbor, inventing new things, cleaning, engineering, technology, all of these different fields, vocational things, some of which may be highly compensated in the marketplace, some of which may not. But these are the things that are part of our day-to-day endeavors that are valuable to God.
So I'm a Protestant, you're a Protestant. This might sound like Protestant work ethic, but you also go through some Catholic scholars as well, especially Pope John Paul II. Can you talk a little bit about the different influences that Catholic thought has had in the book?
Yes, when you're right, you're right. And to me, Pope John Paul II's encyclical, which I believe was published in either 1980 or 1981, Laborem Exercens, is absolute masterpiece. And there may be other Protestant influences of mine that alluded to some of the same concepts, but the way in which Pope John Paul II talked about the transitive nature of work was incredibly impactful on me. And so even as a lifetime Protestant and frankly, a very devout one, I do think there's so much in Catholic social thought that is really quite valuable. I do tend to be a pretty ecumenical Protestant and find myself in co-labor opportunities with my brothers and sisters in the Catholic tradition all the time. But in this particular case, since the pro-life movement, I don't think there's a better chance for Catholics and Protestants to find common ground than this issue about a theology of work, which should parlay into a shared theology of the marketplace. Our defense of free enterprise should be rooted in the same human anthropological commitments, and it could represent decades of Catholics and Protestants working together again towards a great social aim. Transitive nature work, Pope John Paul II, it starts with a subject, and that subject is us, the worker. God made us to do the work, and that subject, that transitive reality of work is that it is outward focused and it moves from a subject to an object. Who is the work serving? Who is the externality that is receiving or benefiting from the goods or services of the work? And that in this transitive process, you have a subject that's where it all begins. The dignity God put in the human worker in creation. You have the work itself that God cares about, and then you have the object of the work who is also a human God cares about. That framework of understanding work transitively with a subject and object and work in between, and all three of these parts of the process mattering to God, I find it to be beautiful.
I didn't count, but it's possible that the most quoted single person in the book is Dorothy Sayers. Can you talk a little bit about her influence on your work here?
Well, I will tell you very honestly, I didn't count either when I wrote it, and then I went back after, and indeed you are correct. It wasn't by design. I had a lot of quotes and a lot of filtering and things around. Tim Keller is in there. Look, Pope John Paul is up there as well. And there's quite a few different quotes and things I think are useful. And yet Dorothy Sayers, what a just incredible essayist and social theorist, and obviously is very well known for her contributions to what became the classical school movement. But writing in the mid 20th century, as she did, I think it's some of the most profound and indeed predictive stuff that I could have imagined. Really, my favorite quote of hers in the book is almost sarcastic, talking to churches. And I can say it in 2023, 24. Um, but it's incredible to me that she was saying this in the 1940s, that churches basically tell a carpenter, hey, the number one thing we need you to focus on is not being drunk in the middle of the week and showing up for church on Sunday. And what they ought to be saying, the number one thing is you need to learn how to make good tables. And in other words, the different pietistic things that do matter in their life, be a good person, follow these certain ethical guidelines, but that when it comes to the nature of the work itself, the Christian church has chosen, and this apparently is now, about 100 years old, to have an escapist or retreatist approach, to preach around the margins, separate from the actual inherent activity any message, any preaching, any ethics, any metaphysics, and go to the outside and just sort of on the margin teach somebody. It would be kind of like telling someone in a marriage, rather than focus on the real relational component, loving someone, just kind of telling them how to dress on a date. It's very cosmetic. And I think Sayers was brilliant in that regard, and just a far more clever writer about these things than I could ever hope to be.
One of the things you argue that the church has missed along those lines is the idea that work is something that we do in order to have enough money to give to the poor, or in order to have enough money to support our family. And obviously, we should give to the poor. Jesus says to do that. We should support our family. That's a given. But that's not the reason why we work. And this also might sound like a semantic point to people, because obviously, look, if you're doing both of those things, if you're working hard, you are making enough money to support your family. Then you're doing it, and whatever, that's good. We should be glad you're doing it. But you really drill in on this point that that's not the purpose. That's not why it exists, even though those are things that we should do. So why do you think it's important to differentiate what we should do from the actual purpose of work itself?
Well, I think that first of all, there is a messaging from a parent to a child that matters a great deal to me here. It is very cliche. It's somewhat understandable, particularly where a lot of this language and attitude came from out of the Great Depression, where there really was just such a scarcity and sacrifice, that people were working, and sometimes with a lot of drudgery, and to come home and tell the kids, my hard work paid for that meal on the table. I get up and go to work so that you can, have clothes, you can have shoes on your feet, you can have a coat on your back. I understand it culturally, but nobody could pay someone to do something that ends up resulting in them having the money to buy shoes and jackets and food, unless the work being done was serving others. It was some part of producing goods and services that meet the needs of humanity. And I think on a macro level, this is something that's very important to you and what we do at National Review with Capital Matters. This is a fundamental economic point, that in our advocacy of free enterprise, we are heralding a system that has allowed a significant part of humanity to marry their passions to their skills, to have optionality in the workforce, to have choice. There is a division of labor that is a key component in classical economics, going back to Adam Smith, who you have known and studied so well. And I think that when we say work is just something we do to put food on the table, we ignore the fact that actually there is a lot of economic opportunity that makes that only true at the first base. That, of course, If we weren't able to have our daily needs met or feed our kids, then the work is inadequate. But that we're able to work above and beyond that. And in that work, ontologically, it is exceeding its transactional benefit. More than just the provision of work, it is also serving others. And again, this goes without saying that the way people used to provide for themselves was to go out and hunt it itself, kill the meat itself, prepare the food themselves. The entire byproduct of work and human action organically over time, as civilization built, in a market economy, we serve others in order to have our needs met. And that's this division of labor that has created such a huge enrichment in society. So to default on a micro level to this reductionist view of work is to deny on a macro level the beauty of free enterprise. I also believe it's important that my kids be raised to understand that work is a blessing, not a curse. And if I message to them that the only reason I work so much is so I could feed them or buy them things or whatnot, then I have programmed them with this transactional view of work. And I want them to understand that there is a joy in the activity, in the calling, in the work itself that transcends the pragmatic benefits. That to me is why this point is so important.
You talk as well about the way that Keynesians look at
Oh,
this stuff in Keynesian economics,
yeah.
um, and they are also very obsessed with work. They view the whole point of fiscal policy as being full employment. They view unemployment as like the top thing to avoid in an economy. They say government should come in. Government should provide people jobs. Government should, we should guarantee a right to employment. If necessary, the government should just create make work jobs for people, even if they don't provide any value, because work is so important, and it's something that we must have for as many people as we can. Uh, since they do not agree with you about the necessary productive elements of work, the necessary, does it add value? Is this useful to other people? They don't agree with you on that, but it sounds like they might say that they do agree with you that work is really, really important. So how would you respond to a Keynesian argument that says, "Yes, we agree with you, David. We think work is really important too. That's why we want to have full employment, and that's why we want to have a right to employment in the Constitution."
Well, what's fascinating is that it only sounds like we're saying the same thing for about half a line in the hymn, that we are not singing from the same hymnal at all, because immediately when they go on to describe the merits of digging a ditch and filling it up again, you realize that the essence of Keynesian economics, as you well know, is the need to facilitate consumption, to stimulate aggregate demand. So they do not believe in work or claim to believe in work for any other purpose than providing the means or sustenance that will enable consumption. And so theologically, as we've already talked about, but and ontologically, as is sort of the important part of my book and what I believe about the being and the essence of man, the more metaphysical argument, and then ultimately economically, this chicken or egg is extremely important. That production drives economic activity, and that what people choose in their consumption preferences then is immediately fed into a reaction function for producers. This is the key value proposition of classical economics, of Austrian economics, of supply side economics, of everything I believe economically. And it is all in stark contrast to what Keynesians believe. They say they want people to work, but that is driven by their ability to go to the mall. That's what they want, is for them to be able to spend. In other words, to feed aggregate demand. And in fact, you will see in times of economic recession, the Keynesians are incredibly fond of transfer payments to help uphold aggregate demand, to avoid a sort of spiral. They are purposely fine with a fiscal counterpunch that would pay people not to work if it would maintain demand. My point in these types of recessionary environments that we find ourselves in is that the Keynesian prescription is not only filled with internal contradictions economically, but it philosophically misses the point of what humans are supposed to be doing, which is not merely shop at the mall, but doing the productive activity that feeds their soul and enables them to afford going to the mall, all the while producing the things that, I don't know, might be at the mall to be bought. And so I think that Keynesianism has always suffered from a devastating chicken or egg fallacy.
You talk in the book about the importance of the example that your father set for you in working, in seeing him work, and that being sort of the norm for you, so that when you grew up, you were able to repeat that in your life. You also say in the book that we have a growing problem in the United States of people growing up without fathers. In some cases, and in many cases, growing up in families with only one parent, whichever parent that happens to be. Uh, do you think that there's an adequate replacement for that, for someone who did grow up in a family without a father? What do you think? What do you think that could be something that would help those people to be able to have that positive example and to see the fruits of work and the reason why work is important?
Well, boy, that's a really good question and a really profound point that I am a beneficiary. See, what I didn't receive that many others did with material prosperity and significant, financial inheritance, I did receive the probably far more important thing of the model of work ethic, of seeing someone who did love his work and pour himself into that work. And your question has to do with those who don't have either. They don't receive either the modeling of this important behavior and mentality, habits, character, or even some of that financial wherewithal. And I've become pretty fond of talking since the book came out about how much I feel a burden to separate a macro and a micro message here. At a macro level, everything we're talking about, it reminds me how important what the work you and I do is about economics, the messaging around reinforcing free enterprise. That at a macro level, those who want to solve for these problems by denigrating a market economy are up to no good. That we need to reinforce labor dynamism, need to reinforce division of labor, mutual cooperation, and the incredible innovations and opportunities that come out of a true commitment to an aspirational society. But at a micro level, I don't think a lot of what I just said is necessarily super helpful on the spot to Billy or Jenny or specific people that might be in an environment of that what you described, not having that modeling. So what can be done for those people? Well, it's like anything in life. Anyone who came from a bad home, anyone who came from bad situations, you have to break the cycle, right? And that's easier said than done. I fully understand that. But it's one of the reasons I wrote the book, Dominic, is I want a message in our churches, in our schools, whatever audience I'm going to end up finding. And then, of course, hopefully some of the audience of the book, they have their own audience that I don't have, and they can proclaim this message. But there is no way around the fact that getting on the other side of this quote unquote income inequality, this social angst, this populist moment, the divide we're dealing with culturally, socially, all we're going to do is exacerbate it by telling people of lower skills, lower education, lower pedigree, and of course, lower parenting opportunity. All we're going to do is basically exacerbate the divide. That to me is our problem, that the top 20% are not going to cooperate. They're not going to stop working. They're not going to stop creating. They're not going to stop innovating. So we need to democratize this message for everybody. And to me, it's the most anti-elite message I have. I'm not saying this as a corner office finance guy. Hey, come on, let's all go be corner office finance guys, lawyers, even academics and writers. There's all kinds of professions out there that have a certain socioeconomic strata attached to them. I'm saying for everyone, and even those who, God forbid, didn't have this modeled in their own home life, that work is an escape from those missed opportunities into the ability of creating new opportunities. That's the message of full time.
And you make very clear multiple times in the book as well that this is, as you said, this is something that applies to every profession across the board. This is not in any way a book that is trying to steer people into certain careers or away from other careers. You see this as something that can be applicable to any job, a person at any age, at any pay rate, right?
I do, and that's one of the reasons it was meant to be somewhat kind of fun, but maybe subtly reinforce the fact that you notice every chapter in the book starts off with one of the jobs I had, throughout my life, and I wasn't really able to avoid the fact that I went into this book knowing that I was writing as a guy who has a career that many would love to have financially and socially in these other categories, but that I don't have that career because I started there. I have it because I ended there, and persisting in this daily productive activity at a career I absolutely love. But that over the years, I had various jobs that were not generally what people think about as a corner office Wall Street guy having. And I loved all of those jobs too. And there is no possible way, none, that I would have the success I've had in finance if I didn't have the journey I had sweeping movie theaters and mowing lawns so I could buy a Commodore 64 computer in the mid 1980s. And so I go through that kind of journey there for a reason. I think that the book should be taken as a repudiation of socioeconomic snobbery in the way we talk about faith and work. But the handicap I have is that I do have a socioeconomically successful aspirational job. And yet my message is for the blue collar worker, for the starving entrepreneur who's a risk taker, who's waiting for an idea to take, for the artist, there's a significant amount of people that play a different role in this vision of kingdom and marketplace that I'm advocating for. And I don't believe for a second that the theology is different for a lawyer, financial advisor, or a plumber. Not for a second. I think that we're all talking about work in the same context theologically.
So you have ending that snobbery as sort of a cultural solution to the problem that you diagnose. You talk about solutions in Christian ministry, about how the church talks about work and how that could be done better in order to help solve this problem. But you don't talk a lot about government policy. Obviously, you're a limited government guy, so that should be expected. But do you see any role for government policy in trying to correct this problem that you diagnose in the book?
Yeah, this is kind of consistent through much of my worldview about public policy. That generally I'm more focused on what government can stop doing to improve something than something they can start doing to improve something. And also, because I'm, the biggest cliche in the world, but I'm such a big advocate of the fact that politics just comes down from culture, right? I think ultimately the lowest hanging fruit in a lot of the things we're talking about here are cultural situations, not political or policy ones. But if we were to get into the nitty gritty of where we can move the needle in the political or specifically public policy level, I'll start with that war on teenage employment. I don't think $22 an hour minimum wage laws for fast food restaurants have anything to do with creating a livable wage for single mothers. I think all it does is take teenagers out of the job market, period. These are jobs that were largely created for the purpose of part-time summer employment from 16-year-olds that just nobody's going to pay them that kind of wage for such menial type work. And so the unintended consequence, trying to create a higher wage for some of the lower skilled members of our workforce, the unintended consequence has been to take teenagers and young adults out of the workforce that then leaves them less equipped when they have to enter the workforce. It's been a total policy disaster. Obviously, on the margins, there's all sorts of very regular notes that we could sing in terms of less regulation and less taxation burdens that I think open up more opportunity. But really, in the present moment we find ourselves in, the other sort of political or policy point I would make is that we cannot view greater state intervention in the market as a solution to what we consider to be some of the concerns or headwinds for work. AI, automation, I will even add to that free trade, by the way, that all that we do is limit labor dynamism. Okay. And we have not, by the way, in the United States, passed laws yet that make it impossible to fire somebody. Now, I think there's a huge need for various legal reform where for many large companies, they're almost assured of getting sued and having to settle, and there's wage and hour, class action, rackets and so forth. But countries like Spain and Italy and France that codified how hard it is to get rid of an employee, they really made it hard to get employees hired. And I think that even making it hard for employees to quit companies, the flexibility that is required in the type of dynamism we have that built so much 20th century prosperity, I am at a loss as to understand who in the world wants to limit that. But most of these public policy prescriptions we're talking about, that's all they would do. And so if we got into the weeds of where I think policy can fit into this, it's almost entirely either stop doing certain things they're doing. California fast food minimum wage laws is a great example. Or don't go do things some people are encouraging you to do, such as restrictions on private equity when they have to terminate employees. All of those things are going to make the problem worse, not better.
Last question for you. Are you ever going to retire?
Well, I don't believe in retirement, so I'm not. Now, I may be hung up in a hospital bed someday, God forbid, and I may one day actually not have to deal with 1,000 emails a day and work from 3:45 in the morning until I fall asleep at night. But if by retirement we mean enter a 25-year vacation, there's absolutely no way. I think it's kind of out there. I don't think it matters me saying it. I've had the financial freedom to not have to work for quite some time. And I work harder now than I ever have. I feel very confident in saying I'm never going to retire, Dominic. But maybe there'll be a few more opportunities with grandkids in the future. We'll see.
All right. Well, it was good talking to you, David. The book is called FullTime: Work and the Meaning of Life. It is not very long. It's very easy to get through, and it covers a lot of ground, though, in just a couple of relatively short chapters. So we are grateful to have David part of what we do here at NRI, and thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us today.
Thanks so much, Dominic.